Donna and Nathan Horwitz stood on opposite sides of the same nightmare, each pointing a trembling finger at the other, each swearing they hadn't pulled the trigger. In the quiet luxury of their Palm Beach home, a man was found shot to death in his own bathtub, and what began as a family tragedy quickly turned into a chilling tale of betrayal, greed, and lies. Behind every accusation hid a secret, and behind every tear, a motive. By the time the truth began to surface, one thing had become certain. This was no ordinary murder, but the slow, deliberate collapse of a family built on control, resentment, and revenge. To everyone in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida, the Horwitz family appeared to live a dream life. Their house was large, framed by palm trees and trimmed hedges that glistened in the sunlight. Lanny Horwitz, a successful real estate developer, was the kind of man people respected. He wore tailored suits, drove a luxury car, and often spoke about hard work and discipline. His wife Donna seemed like the perfect partner, elegant, well-spoken, always smiling at social gatherings. Their son Nathan had once been the pride of his father's eye, but those days were long gone. Beneath the surface of wealth and class there was tension, a kind that no one outside their home could see. Inside the walls of that house, the Horwitz family was unraveling. Lanny's marriage to Donna had turned bitter over the years. They slept in separate rooms and spoke to each other only when necessary. The warmth that once existed between them had been replaced with resentment. Donna often accused Lanny of controlling her every move, while he accused her of wasting money and being ungrateful. Their fights had become routine, echoing through the hallways of their expensive home like clockwork. The neighbors would occasionally hear shouting late at night, but in the morning the couple would appear calm, pretending nothing was wrong. Nathan, their only son, had recently moved back in after a failed marriage and financial troubles. He was in his 30s, angry and lost. Lanny saw him as a disappointment, a man who had squandered every opportunity handed to him. Nathan, in turn, felt humiliated by his father's constant criticism. He would spend hours locked in his room, his mind consumed with frustration. Donna tried to keep the peace, but even her patience was wearing thin. The tension between father and son grew so thick that it felt as if every word spoken in that house carried the potential to explode. Behind the polished front doors, Lanny had grown increasingly paranoid. He installed security cameras around the property, claiming it was for safety, but Donna knew it was more about control. He watched everything. When she left, when Nathan came home, even the times they moved from room to room. Donna often felt like a prisoner in her own home. She began keeping secrets, hiding her movements and phone calls. There were rumors that she had rekindled an old relationship, one that Lanny had recently discovered. It had only made things worse. He confronted her in a rage, accusing her of betrayal and threatening to cut her off financially. The air inside the Horwitz home grew colder with every passing day. Meals were eaten in silence, doors were slammed instead of conversations, and every glance between them carried unspoken hostility. Lanny spent more time at his office, avoiding both his wife and his son. Donna turned inward, retreating into long baths and glasses of wine. Nathan drifted like a shadow, avoiding his father's gaze and pretending not to hear the nightly arguments that still managed to break through the silence. Despite everything, from the outside nothing seemed amiss. Donna still smiled when she greeted the mailman. Lanny still waved to neighbors when he picked up the morning paper. Nathan still mowed the lawn on weekends. The Horwitz family knew how to perform normalcy, but it was only an act. Inside, their family bond was collapsing, held together by habit rather than love. Each of them carried anger, fear, and resentment that had been building for years. What no one could have guessed was that this quiet storm would soon erupt into something far more terrible. Behind those manicured walls, the cracks were no longer just emotional, they were dangerous. Every word spoken had the weight of years of bitterness, and every silent glance carried suspicion. The Horwitz home had become a pressure cooker of jealousy, control, and revenge. Within weeks, it would no longer be a house of wealth and order, but a crime scene that would shock the entire community. It was a bright and ordinary Sunday morning when the peace of Palm Beach Gardens was shattered. The sun had just begun to climb over the rows of palm trees when a trembling voice came through the 911 line. It was Donna Horwitz, barely able to speak, saying her husband had been shot. Her words were broken, panicked, and almost incoherent. Within minutes, police cars were racing down the quiet suburban street, sirens cutting through the still air. Neighbors peeked through their windows, unaware that behind one of those white doors lay a scene of unimaginable horror. When officers arrived, the front door of the Horwitz home was already open. Donna stood in the foyer, shaking uncontrollably. Her robe was stained with something dark, her hair disheveled, her face pale. She pointed toward the back of the house, gasping out words that barely made sense. The officers followed the trail of blood to the master bathroom, where the air felt heavy and metallic. There, inside the large marble tub, lay Lanny Horwitz, lifeless. His body was covered in multiple gunshot wounds. The floor was slick with blood, and the walls were splattered in chaotic patterns that spoke of violence and rage. The room was eerily still, except for the sound of dripping water from the shower head that had been left slightly running. The scent of gunpowder lingered faintly in the air. Officers quickly secured the scene, photographing every inch of the space. Nothing appeared stolen. No drawers had been forced open, no windows broken. Whoever had done this had been inside already. Someone who knew the house, someone who felt comfortable enough to walk freely through it. In another room, Nathan Horwitz was found sitting on the edge of his bed. He was dressed in sweatpants and a t-shirt, his eyes distant, his hands trembling slightly. He told officers he had been asleep when he heard the gunshots. He said he had rushed out but found his mother screaming, and that he never went near the bathroom. When police examined his hands, they noticed faint smudges, traces that could be blood or residue. Nathan insisted he had only touched his mother when trying to calm her down. He seemed calm, almost too calm, as if the shock had not yet reached him. Donna was taken outside, still shaking, repeating over and over that she had woken up to find her husband dead. She claimed she had heard several loud bangs in the early morning hours and thought at first it was thunder. When she went to investigate, she found the door to the master bathroom open and Lanny lying motionless. Her story, however, seemed incomplete. Detectives noticed inconsistencies, small details that didn't fit, like the fact that she hadn't called for help immediately after discovering the body, or that her robe appeared freshly splattered rather than soaked, as if she had been closer to the gunfire than she admitted. The officers began to wonder whether this was a burglary gone wrong, or something much more personal. There were no signs of forced entry, and the alarm system hadn't been triggered. Whoever had killed Lanny knew exactly where to find him, and they had fired with precision. The shooter had stood close, so close that the pattern of wounds suggested an intimate, deliberate act rather than random violence. Outside, as the flashing lights reflected off the windows, neighbors began to gather in hushed clusters. They whispered in disbelief. How could something like this happen here to people like them? But the police had already drawn their first conclusion. The killer was someone inside that house. There were only two possibilities, Donna or Nathan. As detectives cordoned off the property, they began collecting evidence: fingerprints, shell casings, the pistol found in a cabinet nearby. The weapon was registered to Lanny himself. A locked drawer in his office contained another gun, untouched. On a nightstand beside the bed was his phone, the last call made shortly after midnight. The call was to his lawyer. The morning sun climbed higher as the investigation deepened. Donna sat on the front steps, staring into the distance, her hands trembling. Nathan stood a few feet away, arms crossed, avoiding her gaze. Between them hung a silence so heavy that even the detectives could feel it. The Horwitz home, once a place of wealth and comfort, had turned into a house of suspicion. Each minute that passed made it clearer that the truth behind Lanny's death would not be simple. One of them was lying, and the evidence inside that blood-stained bathroom would soon reveal which one. The investigation into Lanny Horwitz's death began with methodical precision. Detectives searched the house inch by inch, collecting everything that might explain what had happened. They found shell casings near the bathtub, a handgun partially hidden behind a towel, and faint smudges of blood leading down the hallway. The medical examiner confirmed that Lanny had been shot multiple times, the fatal bullet entering his chest from close range. Whoever fired the gun had done so deliberately, not in panic or self-defense. This was a targeted killing, carried out by someone who had looked Lanny in the eyes. Detectives quickly discovered that the Horwitz family was far from the picture of harmony they presented to the world. Lanny and Donna's marriage had been deteriorating for years. Divorce papers had been drawn up, and Lanny's lawyer confirmed that he had recently changed his will, removing Donna as a beneficiary. He had grown tired of her spending habits and her temper. Friends told investigators that he had accused her of being unfaithful, and in the weeks before his death their fights had escalated. The change in his will had left Donna furious and desperate, but Nathan's life wasn't spotless either. His father had supported him financially for most of his adult life, and lately that support had been slipping away. Nathan's failed marriage had left him broke, and moving back home had only deepened his resentment. Several friends described Nathan as angry, unstable, and deeply bitter toward his father. He felt like a constant disappointment, living under the same roof as the man who never missed an opportunity to remind him of it. When detectives interviewed Nathan, he stuck to his story. He said he'd gone to bed early and slept through most of the night. He claimed he woke only after hearing his mother scream. But his calm demeanor and lack of emotion unsettled the investigators. They sent his hands and clothing for testing, and the results came back showing faint traces of gunpowder residue. When confronted, Nathan explained that he had handled his father's gun days before while cleaning it, something his father had asked him to do. It was possible but not convincing. Donna's interview painted a different picture. She described her husband as controlling, manipulative, and verbally abusive. She said she had endured years of humiliation and had grown fearful of him. She admitted that they had argued the night before but insisted it was only about finances. Her eyes welled up as she described finding him dead. But the detectives noticed something strange. She seemed more focused on defending herself than mourning her husband. Then came the twist that stunned everyone. When Nathan learned that gunpowder residue had been found on him, he accused his mother. He said she was lying, that she had hated his father for years and had finally snapped. He told detectives that she had been spiraling emotionally, terrified of losing her lifestyle after the divorce. He described how she had begged Lanny to change his mind, and when he refused, she had turned violent. Donna, on the other hand, countered with a different story. She said Nathan had been angry the night before, pacing the house, muttering under his breath. She claimed he had been drinking heavily and had gone to confront Lanny in the bathroom early that morning. According to her, she had been asleep until she heard the shots. When she found Nathan standing near the bathroom door, he told her to go back to bed. That was her version, but it changed slightly each time she retold it. The detectives were caught between two narratives, each as believable as the other. The evidence pointed in both directions. Donna had motive, money, betrayal, fear. Nathan had opportunity, access to the gun, deep resentment, and a history of anger toward his father. The fingerprints on the weapon were smeared, belonging to both of them, making it impossible to determine who had actually pulled the trigger. Forensic teams discovered that the gun had been fired at very close range, suggesting the shooter had known Lanny well. There were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no attempt to escape. Lanny had trusted whoever came into that bathroom, even in his final moments. That trust had cost him his life. As detectives worked through the evidence, a disturbing realization began to form. Both Donna and Nathan had reasons to want Lanny dead, and both had the chance to do it. But only one could have fired the gun. The truth seemed buried beneath years of resentment, secrets, and betrayal. Every new piece of evidence only deepened the mystery. turning what should have been a clear case of domestic violence into one of the most perplexing family murders the small community had ever seen. The courtroom was packed on the morning the trial began. Reporters filled the benches, sketch artists lined the front row, and the air buzzed with anticipation. The murder of Lanny Horwitz had already become one of the most talked about cases in Florida, not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the story behind it. A mother and son turning on each other, each claiming the other was the killer. It was the kind of story that captured public fascination, a tragic mix of wealth, betrayal, and family collapse. Nathan Horwitz sat at the defense table, wearing a gray suit that hung loosely on his frame. His expression was calm, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion. Across the courtroom, Donna sat stiffly, her once elegant posture replaced by visible tension. Though she wasn't on trial, her presence loomed over every word spoken. She was both a witness and an uncharged suspect in the eyes of many. Every time Nathan looked in her direction, she turned away. The prosecution built its case piece by piece, presenting a portrait of Nathan as a man consumed by anger and resentment. They described his strained relationship with his father, the heated arguments, and his dependency on the man he secretly hated. They showed photographs of the crime scene, explaining the angle of the gunshots and the close proximity between victim and shooter. A forensic expert testified that the gunpowder residue found on Nathan's hands could not have come from cleaning a gun days earlier. It was too fresh. The prosecution claimed he had confronted his father in the early morning hours. Shouting turned to violence, and in a fit of rage, he pulled the trigger again and again. But the defense told a very different story. They portrayed Nathan as a son caught between two parents locked in a bitter, toxic marriage. They argued that Donna had the strongest motive. She was on the verge of losing her financial security, her reputation, and her lifestyle. They pointed out that she had been the one to discover the body, that her robe had been spattered with blood, and that her timeline of events kept changing. The defense reminded the jury that Donna had once threatened Lanny during an argument, something corroborated by a neighbor who overheard shouting from the house weeks before the murder. As the days passed, witnesses took the stand, friends, neighbors, even Lanny's business associates. Some described Nathan as angry and unpredictable, while others called him polite and misunderstood. A friend of Donna's testified that she had been terrified of her husband and often talked about leaving him but didn't know how. The jurors listened intently, their faces unreadable. When Donna was called to testify, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke in a trembling voice, describing years of control and humiliation at Lanny's hands. She said she had loved her husband once but had come to fear him. When asked about the night of the murder, she claimed she had taken a sleeping pill before bed and heard nothing until the gunshots woke her. She denied touching the gun and insisted that Nathan had been angry and unpredictable in the days leading up to the killing. Her testimony painted a haunting picture of a son who had finally snapped under years of pressure. Then Nathan took the stand. He spoke quietly, his voice steady but emotionless. He described his father as impossible to please, a man who belittled him constantly. He admitted they had fought the night before, but swore he had gone to bed afterward. He said he woke to the sound of his mother screaming and rushed to find his father dead. When asked if he believed his mother killed Lanny, he paused, looked straight ahead, and said he didn't want to believe it, but nothing else made sense. The cross-examination was brutal. The prosecution hammered him with inconsistencies, pointing out moments when his story didn't line up with physical evidence. They suggested that his calm demeanor wasn't shock but indifference. They accused him of crafting a story that placed blame on the only other person who could have done it. The jury watched every movement, every hesitation, every flicker of emotion. When closing arguments began, the lawyers painted two competing versions of the same tragedy. One was the story of a violent, resentful son who murdered his father in cold blood. The other was of a desperate, cornered wife who saw no other way out. When the jury left to deliberate, the courtroom sat in heavy silence. Hours stretched into a full day. Outside, the media waited with cameras ready, broadcasting every update. Inside, Nathan sat motionless beside his attorney. Donna sat alone on a bench, her hands clasped tightly together. Both waited for a decision that would decide not only who would spend a lifetime behind bars, but also which version of the truth would be remembered. The story that had begun inside a family home was now in the hands of 12 strangers who had to choose which betrayal to believe. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell completely silent. Every camera turned toward the door as the jurors filed in, faces grave and unreadable. Nathan stood as the clerk read the verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. His mother gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. The judge's voice echoed through the room as the sentence was announced: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Nathan's eyes remained fixed on the floor, his expression calm but hollow. Donna's tears came slowly, though no one could tell whether they were tears of grief or relief. As Nathan was led away in handcuffs, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, shouting questions that neither mother nor son would ever answer. For the public, the case had come to an end, but for those who had followed every detail, something about it still felt unfinished. Too many inconsistencies lingered, too many questions had been left unanswered. Years passed, and the story of the Horwitz family faded from the headlines. The house in Palm Beach Gardens was sold, its new owners unaware of the darkness that once filled its walls. Donna moved to a smaller home on the coast, living quietly, rarely seen in public. Nathan began serving his sentence in a state prison, maintaining his innocence from day one. He wrote letters to lawyers, journalists, and anyone who might listen, insisting his mother had framed him. Most dismissed him as another convicted murderer unwilling to face the truth, but one investigator didn't. Nearly a decade after the trial, a retired forensic analyst revisited the case as part of a documentary review on wrongful convictions. She noticed discrepancies in the blood spatter analysis. The trajectory of the gunshots, when reconstructed, suggested that the shooter had been shorter than Nathan. At the time, the police had focused on the most obvious suspect, given the father-son feud, and hadn't rechecked every measurement. She also pointed out that the residue pattern on Donna's robe suggested she had been much closer to the gunfire than she claimed. Further examination revealed another troubling detail. The gun found near the scene had traces of a cleaning solvent on it, as if it had been wiped after being fired. The partial fingerprints that investigators once thought were too smudged to identify showed faint traces of a manicure product, something Donna used regularly. It wasn't enough for a new trial, but enough to reignite questions about whether justice had truly been served. Donna refused interviews when reporters reached out for comment. Her silence only deepened the mystery. Some neighbors believed she had carried guilt for years, haunted by what had happened. Others said she had simply grown cold and distant, living the remainder of her life in isolation. When she died quietly in her sleep several years later, there were no confessions, no letters, no final words to explain what had really happened that morning. Nathan received the news of her death in prison without visible emotion. He had spent years trying to appeal, filing petition after petition, all denied. In interviews, he spoke of betrayal, of how his mother had turned the world against him. Yet deep down, even he seemed uncertain. The memories of that morning had blurred over time, leaving only fragments: his mother's scream, the sound of footsteps, the weight of disbelief. The murder of Lanny Horwitz remains one of those cases that refuses to settle, even long after the verdict. Everyone involved carried their own version of the truth. Some believed Nathan had done it in a moment of uncontrollable rage, finally breaking under the pressure of his father's cruelty. Others were convinced that Donna, driven by fear and greed, had pulled the trigger herself, then carefully crafted a story that placed blame on her son. The truth, it seemed, had died with both of them. The house, now renovated and filled with new life, stood as the only witness left. Behind its fresh paint and manicured lawn were memories no one could erase, the echo of gunshots, the whispers of accusation, and the haunting image of a family destroyed by secrets. To the world, it was a closed case. To those who still studied the evidence, it remained an unsolved puzzle. And somewhere in the middle of those two realities lay the answer to a question that would never be truly known. Who killed Lanny Horwitz and why? The only certainty was that the truth had been buried long before the verdict was read, and that the Horwitz name would forever be tied not to wealth or success, but to a mystery born from blood and betrayal.